Another thing I want to point out about this slide is that these are what are called stasis points in a controversy. They are points at issue where each side specifically disagrees with the other side on a given topic. A current example of this might be the healthcare debate we have now. There are people who clearly believe that we need universal health coverage, and there are people who clearly believe that we don't need universal health coverage, that we should not be turning that over to the government, and there are a whole set of stasis points on each side of that issue. So stasis was a very important concept in the construction of discourse in Greek society, because a lot of the significant discourse was organized around stasis issues and talked out through that. Okay. So let's move on to slide 10. Well, having noticed everything disparaging that Plato said about rhetoric and that Aristotle, other people had the same concerns, what can be said on rhetoric's behalf? What are the good aspects of rhetoric? Well, first of all, rhetoric can enable us to see that there are two sides or more sides to many questions. Rhetoric can enable us through the use of stasis and discussion to weigh opposing viewpoints and help us to critically consider the options available. Secondly, rhetoric is supposedly based on the idea that everyone has free speech and can defend oneself. And of course, everyone in Athens did exclude women, so not everyone, but everyone who was eligible to participate could have free speech and defend oneself. The third thing that can be said on rhetoric's behalf is that it enables a diversity of views, many different views, to be expressed and does contribute to democracy and the power of the people. So there are some things that can be said on rhetoric's behalf. And I think that it might be fair to say that some of the philosopher's views were somewhat elitist. That is to say, they believed that only certain people were entitled to be participants, whereas the sophists were much more open-minded about the possibilities of people's participation. Moving on to slide 11, I want to talk about probabilities. This is one of my favorite topics. And it's very much unlike the way we reason today. So it is a real marked difference. They like to argue based on probabilities in ancient Greece. And a probability, as Aristotle tells us, is a thing that usually happens in a contingent situation. It's not based on hard evidence, but on what is most likely in a given situation. So where our first recourse in this society is often to facts, statistics, and that sort of thing, that was not the case at this time in Greece. So they used probabilities, and I'll give you some examples. My first example has to do with my experience last Saturday morning. I found myself going shopping, and I found that my debit card was missing from my wallet. Should I go home and look for it before continuing my shopping, or not? That was the decision I had to make. So I tried to remember when I last used it, and it came to me that I last used it when I bought gas the day before. I then knew pretty much where it was, and I decided not to go home, where it probably was, based on the best of my recollection, but not necessarily. And so if we were in class, I would say, where do you think it probably was? And someone would probably say, it was probably in the pocket of what you were wearing when you bought the gas, and you never took it out and put it back in your wallet, which is exactly where it was when I went home. So that's a probability argument. One that's a little less accessible, well, let me give you the other example. In a legal trial, if any of you are familiar with how the process works, we might assume that a person who had a motive to commit a crime, the opportunity to commit the crime, and no alibi for having committed a crime, it was very probable that he, in fact, or she did commit the crime. So that's a probability argument. The one that is commonly used in a lot of the literature that you read about Greek thinking at the time is about the weak man and the strong man. And this comes from the Corax and Tisius, who were like very early sophists, and a trial that they were involved in. And so here's the argument here. If a weak man is accused of assaulting a stronger man, could that man argue that it is not probable that he would attack a man stronger than he is? Because after all, he's weaker. He's likely to get beat up. But if he is likely to be viewed as guilty because he's the stronger man of the two, he could argue that it is not probable that he would have assaulted the weaker man because everyone would have expected him of being guilty. So you've got a probability on either side of the case there. The judge on that particular trial threw the case out. There's a joke about that I won't give you now, but he threw the case out. He said, bad crow, bad egg. One of them was named Corax, which is for I did tell the joke anyway. Okay. Let's move on to slide 12 then. The preference for probability arguments in Athens during Plato's time is related to the fact that in Athens during Plato's time, legal cases were decided by the jurors. Now, these were not jurors in the sense that we think of jurors in today's society. Jurors were citizens who were selected from a pool of 6,000 Athenian citizens, and each jury panel was made up of 201 or more jurors from the common people. Okay, so it isn't jurors, like they weren't screened by lawyers or the way we do things today. Instead, they were drawn by lot from a larger group of people. The presiding officer in Greek trials during Plato and Aristotle's time was a moderator of proceedings or a facilitator of proceedings and not a judge. So when you see, for example, Aristotle talking about judges, he's actually talking about the jurors, the people who are actually going to vote after the arguments in the trial are given. Then the trial proceeded where each litigant, there was a prosecutor who was brought a complaint, and a defendant who defended himself from the complaint each presented their own side of the case with an opportunity for one rebuttal by the other person. So the people they were talking to were just common citizens, and in this particular situation, probabilities were the preferred way of arguing. They were preferred because the jurors thought that facts introduced in the case could be fabricated, and witnesses who might be called to support the case could be bribed. And so they found probabilities more persuasive than some other things that we might more readily accept today, like facts, expert evidence, and other matters of that kind. So I've given you some examples of probability arguments and how they might operate in the context of the Greek trial situation. Now at this point I'm going to end the lecture, and I will discuss the remaining slides of this particular PowerPoint next week. Please let your TFs know if you have questions about this, and we hope that you'll have a successful weekend reading the materials that we have assigned.